I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from returning guest, a regular on the program, James Dorsey of the Turbulent World blog. Dorsey is a great independent journalist on all things related to the Middle East and the politics of the region. We'll be discussing a number of topics in this conversation. And in case you're wondering, I know in the past there's been some background noise in some of my conversations with James. There's much less of that on this edition of the program. And you'll hear us talk about Mohammed bin Salman and Saudi Arabia, Al-Shara's visit to Washington, D.C., the Gaza Ceasefire, which some are calling a fragile ceasefire, others say it's a farce, and, of course, the MAGA split on Israel. All that and more on this edition of the program. Before we get to the conversation with James Dorsey, I'd like to remind you that this show is made possible first by my sponsor, Mike Swanson of Wall Street Window, a great financial and trading newsletter. I've had listeners make return on investment from Mike's trading tips, so if you are interested in that, please consider signing up to Mike's newsletter at wallstreetwindow.com. If you sign up now, you can also get a copy of Mike's free ebook, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I have ever used. Check that out if you can at wallstreetwindow.com. And of course, it is also you, the listener, that makes this show possible. I'm hoping this month to expand my pool of Patreon supporters. I only need a few more $5 supporters this month. Even a few more $1 supporters would be great. You get to hear my conversations every month with C. Derek Varn on the Patreon exclusive Parallax Vlog show. And of course, it helps to keep this program going. I do not make as much money as some other content creators. I only have one sponsor, the aforementioned Mike Swanson of Wall Street Window. Otherwise, this show is entirely listener funded. So if you can, please support me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. I know times are tough, but I could really use your support if possible. I only need a few more supporters at the $1 or $5 tiers at this time. Any amount helps, really. So if you can, please, patreon.com/parallaxviews. Help keep independent journalism and free thinking conversation alive. With all that being said, let's get right to the conversation with James Dorsey. Also, before I forget, if you are at the $10 tier or above on my Patreon, and you have not been included in the producer's credits section of the show, which is at the end of the program, please direct message me on Patreon or email me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com or hit me up on Twitter at Views Parallax. There's been some issues with my email system. This keeps happening over and over again. So if you haven't been mentioned in the producer's credits section, please contact me and I will rectify that. Thank you so much. And now on to the conversation again with James Dorsey. Welcome back to Parallax Views, a guest who, I feel like we have him on monthly now. James M. Dorsey of the Turbulent World blog and Substack will be talking about the latest developments in the Middle East. How are you doing, James?
I'm doing well. I hope so are you.
I'm doing well as well, and there's a lot happening, including Al-Shara's visit to the United States. And the latest news I've seen is that the U.S. has waived its sanctions on Syria after that meeting. What do you make of this meeting, and what should we be taking away from it?
Well, first of all, I think what Ahmed let me start differently. This is a historic meeting. It's the first time that a Syrian president visits the White House. It's also historic because of the background of Ahmed al-Sharaa, a jihadist who fought the Americans. You had this spectacular meeting in September on the sidelines of the United Nations between General Petraeus and Ahmed al-Sharaa, who last saw each other on the battlefield. So this was a historic visit by definition. Sharaa got out of it not quite what he wanted. He wanted to see the Caesar sanctions fully lifted. That's not within the powers of Donald Trump. That has to be done by Congress. And so you saw Sharaa lobbying Congress throughout his visit to Washington, and not unsuccessfully. There are some holdouts, but by and large, he had a very favorable reception. And so what he got was an executive order, essentially, which suspends the sanctions for 6 months. That gives Congress time to fundamentally erase or lift the sanctions. Whether that's going to be enough for Sharaa to get the kind of investment that he needs in the reconstruction of Syria and in fixing its vast economic problems is a different question, but it is a first step. He also got, both he and Trump got Syria joining the campaign against the Islamic State. And that's significant. First of all, the Islamic State still is a threat in Syria. On top of that, there are thousands of Islamic State-related people, whether fighters or their families, in camps predominantly administered by the Syrian Kurds, and there will have to be a solution for that. But what it really more fundamentally does, it positions Syria as a moderate Arab state. Until December of last year, until the fall of Bashar al-Assad, Syria was part of the rejection front, or what the Iranians called the axis of resistance. Syria's links with Iran have been broken. Syria's links with groups like Hezbollah have been broken, and so that positions Syria in a very different way. What Trump didn't get was that Syria would join countries like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, who in a set of accords in 2020 recognized Israel and established diplomatic relations. There are serious security issues between Israel and Syria, which have to be resolved, and they may be close to being resolved, but nonetheless, involving Israel's um, expansion of territory it occupies from Syria beyond the Golan Heights. Since the fall of Bashar al-Assad, Israel's banning or trying to ban uh, Syrian forces from moving south of Damascus. It's Israel's projection of itself as the protector of Syrian minorities, particularly the Druze, but also potentially the Kurds, and of course while Sharaa has made clear that he does not want conflict with Israel, and that he does want some kind of security arrangement, there's no way that Syria would break with much of the Arab and Muslim world at this moment and establish diplomatic relations without a resolution of the Gaza war. And of course, for Syria specifically, there's no way that it can surrender the Golan Heights, which Trump has recognized as Israeli territory. He's recognized the annexation.
If I could, I wanted to ask you, I find it hard to talk about Syria because I I think that various different groups have different agendas when it comes to Syria. I think there's a lot of ethno-religious conflicts when talking about Syria. So I want to ask, when you put aside uh, various different commentators and their agendas, what are the challenges that Al-Sharaa faces in Syria right now, a year or so on from the downfall of Assad?
The challenges are multiple. One are the minorities that are, in the case of the Druze and certainly the Alawites, feel very insecure. And the government's record has been mixed since it came into office. You've had serious violence, both in Alawite areas and in Druze areas. The Kurds, with Turkey and the United States involved, despite all kinds of agreements, and the Syrian Kurds and the Sharaa government do not see eye to eye. The Sharaa government position in terms of wanting to integrate the Kurds into the Syrian military, not as a unified force, but as individuals, and also the Sharaa government's opposition or advocacy of a unified Syrian state rather than a federated state, as also Turkey would like to see. That's one set of challenges. A second set of challenges are foreign fighters. You recently saw fighting around an encampment in which is led by a French Senegalese jihadist. And you saw, despite the fact that Syria recently created a separate division within the Syrian military, Division 84, for foreign fighters, and give them a path to integrate. You saw, and that's a division that predominantly are Uyghur jihadists who originate in China, in northwestern China, in Xinjiang. You saw those Uyghur fighters coming to the aid of this French Senegalese led jihadist group. So that's a second set of challenges that he has. Syria's economy and infrastructure is a wreck. There are electricity problems, there is housing problems, there are devastated cities, and Syria needs a significant amount of reconstruction. So the challenges are multiple, and they're huge.
For people say in the United States, what do you think is the best way to understand the sort of ethno-religious tensions in Syria? I'm asking this because there's a lot of talk about Alawites, especially, fears that there's violence against them. I mean, there has been violence against them, but then people also say, well, I mean, I've had people say, well, the Alawites deserve it because they support Assad. And I feel like uh, people get very political with this, but when you put aside the politics, how should we be understanding the concerns that different ethno-religious uh, groupings have in Syria?
Look, I think, first of all, none of these minority groups are homogeneous in their views. There are divisions within all of these groups. Alawites are afraid. The Assad regimes, Hafiz al-Assad, Hafiz al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad's father and Bashar himself were Alawites. And obviously there was Alawite support, and Alawites were favored under the Assads. That creates resentment. The Druze, this is a religious Sunni Muslim regime, or government, sorry. And the Druze are widely viewed as heretics by Orthodox Sunni Muslims. So there are fears there. The Kurds have long wanted autonomy and were able to achieve a degree of autonomy because they had U.S. support in the Syrian civil war. They were essentially the shock troops, the ground troops in the fight against the Islamic State. So there are all kinds of concerns there, and it's up to the government to try and alleviate those concerns. Obviously, policies are one way of doing it. Truth commissions may be another. None of that has really been implemented yet. And now, to be fair, the government's only in office since December, so less than a year. But nonetheless, there's a lot of confidence building that will be needed.
In terms of the lifting of sanctions, how important do you think that is for Syria right now?
It's fundamental. You cannot pay with a credit card in Syria. You cannot transfer money. So, in terms of both the domestic economy and in terms of foreign investors coming in, lifting those sanctions is sine qua non.
Before we move on to other topics, what do you think hangs in the balance now after this meeting between Al-Sharaa and Trump? I mean, what are the possible outcomes we're going to see in the future? I know we don't have a crystal ball or anything, but what do you think people should be focused on right now when it comes to Syria, its relations with the US, and what it means for both the US and Syria?
Well, it's interesting that Ahmed al-Sharaa, despite this being a historic visit, or maybe because it was such a historic visit, didn't get the treatment that other foreign leaders get. He didn't come through the same entrance into the White House. There was no expanded question. There was no question and answer session whatsoever. The meeting was behind closed doors, and Sharaa left, which is probably because there is within Trump's own support base, but also among pro-Israeli groups, a great deal of hesitation towards Ahmed al-Sharaa. And I think that there's, Trump has in a sense embraced Ahmed al-Sharaa, said he's the man who can pull Syria together and keep it together. But nonetheless, he's going to need help. So, with other words, I think an important thing to look at is going to be, fine, you have lifted the sanctions. Is that something that the average Syrian on the streets of Damascus, for example, is going to feel.
In terms of the Middle East more broadly, what do you think the biggest issues are right now? I mean, there's a lot of talk about the fragile ceasefire in Gaza, and there's also just so much going on at once. I don't really know where to start. I think all eyes have been on Gaza. Do you think that's an area we should talk about? And also, are there any other areas with regards to the sort of turbulence in the Middle East right now that we need to cover?
Well, I think Gaza, without question. There's a lot of debate about Iran. And of course, you have the upcoming visit on the 18th by the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, to Washington, the first time since the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who was murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in 2018. So, I mean, I think those are going to be the flashpoints may not be the correct word, at least um, in terms of the bin Salman visit and Iran, but nonetheless, those are going to be dominant or prominent themes.
Can we focus on that for a bit? What I've been very interested in uh, bin Salman's latest sort of moves and how he is trying to position Saudi Arabia, especially in terms of its sort of public relations. What is the sort of end game for Saudi Arabia right now? What does bin Salman want for Saudi Arabia in the, I guess, next 10 to 20 years?
He wants Saudi Arabia to be one of the foremost, if you wish, second tier powers, if not a global power. He certainly wants to transform Saudi Arabia economically and socially. Politically, it's always been an authoritarian and autocratic state. He's made it even more autocratic. And there's little reason to believe that that's going to change. But he's put great effort into economic diversifying the economy, turning Saudi Arabia into a 21st century knowledge society, putting it on the map in multiple ways, including with the use of sports. So that's what his agenda is, essentially. And he is doing that in obviously a part of the world that's very volatile. So he wants to be seen as a peacemaker. But he is also someone who keeps very close tabs on what public opinion is. So any expectation, for example, that he's going to be more concessionary towards Israel when he comes to the White House, I think is pie in the sky. The Saudis are not going to move publicly, certainly not recognize Israel in any form or fashion, without not just a ceasefire in Gaza, but a pathway to an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel. Public opinion, there is anger on the streets of the Arab world, including Saudi Arabia, with regard to Israel because of the Gaza conflict. One interesting thing for which there hasn't been an explanation is that he recently appointed a new Grand Mufti of the kingdom. This is a man who's an arch conservative. He's a Wahhabi, has been a Wahhabi throughout his life. Now he's also, to a degree, an opportunist, in the sense that he's bowed to, as much of the Saudi clergy has done, bowed to what the government wants. But this is a man of 90 years old. And so the question is, why was he appointed? He clearly is a bridge figure. But one question, or one theory, of course, is that this was to placate religious critics, and he didn't. And if that's correct, he may not have wanted to put someone in that position with a presumably longer lifespan.
It's
But
very. Mhm.
that's a theory. Let's be clear about that.
Well, what interests me about Saudi Arabia right now is, as you point out, it's still very autocratic, and I think it's going to remain as such. But there's
It's more
also things,
autocratic than it has ever been.
yeah, yeah, and it's interesting to me because at the same time, there's things I think Western audiences or like Western political types would would like that are happening in Saudi Arabia. For instance, I know that women's access to higher education is expanding a lot in recent years. I'm curious as to what's happening because it's not that it's becoming more liberal. It's more autocratic than ever, but there are these sort of cultural changes afoot. How are we to make sense of these things, especially with regards to gender relations in Saudi Arabia?
Look, I think that it's not that actually not all that complex. On the contrary, you have economic liberalization, certainly in terms of diversification. You still have an economy that's state driven, and where while there is an emphasis on the private sector still doesn't have the space to really expand independent of the government. You have social liberalization without question. And the fact of the matter is that you can have those two strands of liberalization without politically liberalizing. Now, you can question whether political autocracy stifles creativity, and therefore uh, uh, threatens economic development, threatens social development, and there's degrees of truth in that. But there within certain limits, there creativity is possible.
You mentioned he may have appointed this Grand Mufti to placate sort of religiously inclined critics. Uh, does bin Salman sort of walk a tightrope these days in terms of the Saudi population?
Um, I don't think he does that yet. He has to deliver, but has to particularly deliver on jobs. He has to deliver on opportunity, and to some degree, he is delivering, not at the pace that many had expected, but he is to some degree delivering. Um, Now, we don't have independent public opinion polls in Saudi Arabia, but there is a very significant segment of the population that supports the reforms that he's introduced. There's also a significant segment of the population that is critical. Uh, so it's he's played with the idea um, that there may be a threat. Um, I don't think that threat is imminent. I also think that if you look at it historically, the most stable regimes or the most durable regimes in the Middle East and North Africa have proven to be monarchies.
Uh, do you mind if I ask why is that? Because I mean, I was talking recently with someone about Jordan. Jordan's also a monarchy, and it seems very stable despite some internal issues. Why is it that the monarchies don't falter as much in the Middle East?
Depends who you ask. I
Fair
mean,
enough.
if you take someone like Robert Kaplan, he argues that not just for the Middle East, he argues that for much of the world. And he in his latest book, Wasteland, draws a comparison between Weimar in the 1920s and 1930s in Germany and the current state of affairs globally in the world. And he argues, I'm I've got question marks about it, but nonetheless he argues that if you hadn't done away with the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns and the Romanovs and the Ottomans, you may not have had World War One and World War Two.
In terms of looking at Saudi Arabia, and I know we have other things we have to talk about, but with regards to Saudi Arabia, what does the situation with Saudi Arabia and how bin Salman is maneuvering right now, how does this relate to like the broader Middle East? Are there other countries that we can see parallels with in the Middle
Well, I
East?
think that you've got certainly three Gulf countries, and to a degree Egypt, that are projecting themselves as the key powers and Turkey, of course, as key powers in the Middle East. Uh, you've got the Saudis, you've got the United Arab Emirates, you have Qatar, which obviously has the advantage of being a mediator, and you have the Turks, who are certainly at the moment playing a very influential role when it comes to Hamas and when it comes to trying to put flesh on the skeleton of Trump's Gaza plan.
Let's talk more about that. What do you make of Trump's Gaza plan and what has happened with this first phase of what's being called the ceasefire? Although it's like this is all, I don't know what to make of it anymore because I feel like this is going to fall apart, but I don't have a crystal ball either. So
Look, I think, first of all, one's got to understand that both Israel and Hamas, despite whatever the projections are, only accepted the first phase of the ceasefire. And to be fair, leaving aside the daily Israeli attacks, which the Palestinians, Israeli attacks on Gaza, which the Palestinians see as violations, the ceasefire is more or less held. Uh, there is more humanitarian aid going in, not in the amounts that were agreed upon, but nonetheless, there is more going in. You had all living hostages or captives released in exchange for Palestinians. You're the last of the bodies of Israeli of Israeli captives are being returned. We're now down to 5 remaining bodies that still have to be returned. So far, so good in a sense, with all the caveats. The problem is that the rest of the plan are ideas, they're principles. There are no agreed implementation mechanisms, and there are no agreements on what implementation means. And that makes it extremely fragile. Plus, you have question marks about the sincerity in the second phase of both the Israelis and Hamas. And you're seeing that playing out at the moment, for example, in terms of the question of Hamas fighters who are trapped in tunnels in Rafah, and what is to be done with them and what is to happen with them. You've got Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, the U.S. envoys in Jerusalem at the moment, trying to resolve that, and it's beyond intention. It's a very tricky issue, particularly for for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, because what the Americans would like to see is that these Hamas fighters would be allowed to uh, get out of the tunnels and be given safe passage to Hamas-controlled areas of Gaza, which leads you to a second set of problems, which is that at this moment, Hamas is essentially split into two areas, one controlled by Israel and one controlled by Hamas and other Palestinian groups.
Did you
Uh,
mean to say you said Hamas is split into two areas? Did you mean to say Gaza is split into two
Gaza
areas?
split
Okay.
into two areas, yes. Um, and so that's not a sustainable situation. It's certainly not a situation in which Arab and Muslim states are going to um, want to contribute to a international stabilization force. You don't have a clear definition of what that force's mandate is. Um, Arab and Muslim potential participants in such a force will not be wanting to be seen as carrying out Israel's agenda, which leads you, among other things, to the issue of disarmament. What does disarmament of Hamas, what and other Palestinian groups, and what does that entail? What does that mean? Now, on the plus side, the U.S. has circulated a draft resolution in the United Nations Security Council, which would basically anchor an international stabilization force in international law. But you still have the question of on what terms, what mandate, are Israeli troops going to withdraw completely from Gaza? How quick is that going to happen? So there are multiple issues, major issues, with the Trump proposal that make the ceasefire fragile, but also raise the question whether this is really going to happen.
I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I know I'm going to have listeners that'll say that there's going to be listeners that argue, as you said, Palestinians have said, well, Israel is violating the ceasefire with all these bombardments. So there will be people that will say, well, how is this a ceasefire then? Do you want to respond to those sort of
How is
accusations?
how is
There will
sorry?
be, I think there will be people that say, well, Israel is already violating the ceasefire due to these bombardments. So how is there a ceasefire? Or they'll say, "Oh, the ceasefire isn't real." Like, how would you respond to people saying those things?
How do you define a ceasefire? And I think let's put it this way: people's expectations are that that means ceasing fire. Period. That's not how the Israelis interpret it. It may also not be how Hamas is interpreted. Now, it, as a matter of principle, as far as I can see, a majority of Israeli strikes are unprovoked by Hamas. But there have been provocations. There have been Israelis killed since the ceasefire. And that may be a strategy on Hamas's part, not to calibrate it, but nonetheless to so there are violations on both sides, without question. That doesn't port well for a sustainable ceasefire. Look at the whole debate about Lebanon, where Israel continuously still attacks because it wants to keep the pressure up both on the Lebanese government and on Hezbollah. Uh, but it is an improvement on what we've seen, uh, or compared to what the situation was before the ceasefire. And let's face it, we're talking about more than 2 million people in absolutely dire straits. So any improvement is an improvement.
The other issue I want to bring up in regards to this is a lot of people will talk about uh, Hamas needs to disarm, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's reasons Hamas doesn't want to fully disarm because I suspect it would be, in a lot of ways, suicidal for them to do so, given all the competing clans that also have issues with Hamas in Gaza. Are there barriers to disarmament?
Well, first of all, we don't know yet what disarmament means. In other words, does that mean
It's a bit
they're
murky,
going
yeah.
to are they going to disarm uh, or decommission everything down to a small caliber pistol, or are they going to surrender or decommission their heavy weapons, whatever is left of that, and be allowed to keep their sidearms? That's one issue. And how is that going to be done? Israel seems to think that that an international destabilization force would be tasked with disarming Hamas, even if that means violent clashes. I don't see any of the potential states that would join such a force wanting to embark on such a mission. I think another factor to keep in mind is that there is still substantial support for Hamas. There still is in Gaza and in the West Bank. There's substantial support for armed struggle. Now, there's also substantial support for a negotiated end to the conflict. And despite support for Hamas, or degree of support for Hamas, that does not necessarily mean that they would translate into a Hamas victory if there were elections today. On the contrary, one of the interesting jokers in all of this is a remark that Donald Trump made a couple of weeks ago, where he said that he was considering pressuring the Israelis to release Marwan al-Baghrouti. Marwan al-Baghrouti is serving four or five life sentences plus 40 years in prison because he allegedly was involved in the planning of several attacks a fair number of years ago in which Israelis were killed. But he also, if you look at polls, is the most credible, most popular Palestinian leader today.
He's seen as the potential
And
unifying figure.
he's seen as a unifying figure. He's also he's got good relations with Hamas. I mean, he comes out of Al-Fatah, Hamas's arch rival. And he's also seen as a proponent of a two-state solution, which leads me to one last point here. I don't think that the issue, the visceral Israeli opposition, despite the massacre and the atrocities that happened on October 7, 2023, when Hamas attacked Israel and sparked this whole crisis. At the end of the day, I don't really think it is about Hamas, nor do I think it's about disarmament. This is about the maintenance of Palestinian national aspirations. That's what Israel is most concerned about. Israel wants, is making a two-state solution physically increasingly difficult, if not impossible, on the West Bank. There's no question that if Israel had its way, it would annex the West Bank. And Netanyahu and Netanyahu even before this last government with or coalition with the ultra nationalists was hell bent on squashing Palestinian national rights and aspirations. And that's what I think really is the crux of the matter.
In other words, there's this desire for, I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is Netanyahu and his cohorts kind of want to crush the dream of Palestinian national aspirations.
Absolutely. I mean, and they make no bones about it.
In terms of what's happening in the West Bank, I know there was settler attacks recently against Palestinians, journalists at a West Bank olive harvest. I'm seeing news. Settlers launch major arson attack against Palestinian land in central West Bank. And Israeli control really has transformed the West Bank in the 2 years since the Hamas attack. The Israeli control of the West Bank has increased. So what does all of this entail? How important is it that people start talking about the West Bank in addition to Gaza?
It's very important. Uh, and it's important on several levels. One is that the Israelis would like to keep Gaza separate from the West Bank. And it's important to maintain those links, first of all. Second of all, the one of the problems with the Trump proposal is it makes no mention of the West Bank. And so what many fear could be the result is essentially a divvying up of Palestinian territory. So the sustained separation of Gaza from the West Bank, but also the parceling up of the West Bank itself.
I wanted to ask, I know we only have maybe 10 or so more minutes, because I know you have another engagement, but
Yeah, that just was moved back by about 15 minutes. So
okay. I really want to ask, are there ways in which a lot of the actions Israel is taking now could end up blowing back on Israel? Because I get the feeling that Netanyahu's approach, I'm trying to use a neutral term, but I mean, this has been really bad the past 2 years, and I feel like Israel is cutting itself in different ways by doing these things. I mean, making a two-state solution impossible is one of those ways. I think Israel is actually hurting itself in the process. Am I off base with that, or is there an argument, I guess, to be made for that Israel is actually doing itself a disservice?
look, I don't think you're off base. On the contrary, I think Israel's feeling the blowback. Uh, if you look at what was happening just before the ceasefire was declared, Israel was on the verge of being facing economic sanctions from the European Union. The EU is Israel's largest trading partner, larger than the United States. The EU is the largest investor, and Israel invests far more in Europe than it invests in the United States. You're seeing the blowback with the boycott, with the effects of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement in academia. You're seeing that in music. So Israel is feeling that blowback without question. And then you look at increasing criticism within among evangelicals of Israel and of among a segment of the Make America Great Again crowd. And add to that the problem that some of that blowback among evangelicals and among one segment of the Make America Great Again crowd is that it's laced with blatant anti-Semitism. And then there's another aspect to the evangelical movement. 70%, or let me put it differently, the American evangelicals have politicized or weaponized, in a sense, their theological beliefs, particularly their belief in the end times. And they've turned it into a recipe or a mandate for alignment with Israel. The fact of the matter is that 70% of the evangelical community is not American. It's in the global South. It's in Asia. It's in Africa. It's in Latin America. And if you look at the global movement, take one organization, for example, the World Evangelical Alliance. The World Evangelical Alliance represents 600 million evangelicals in 161 countries. Until March of this year, it was led by a German religious scholar with very close ties to Pope Francis, but also to the German political establishment. Today, the chairman of that alliance is a Sri Lankan. The CEO, the general secretary of the alliance, is an Israeli Palestinian in Nazareth. And you're seeing that shift across the board in the non-American alliance. Those are realities Israel has to deal with.
Well, what are the implications then of those realities with regards to evangelicals in the global South?
Well, first of all, you don't have the alignment with Israel. You don't have that politicization or weaponization of theology. American evangelicals may not care, in some ways may not care about what other evangelicals think about them. But fact of the matter is that American evangelicals have put over many years, decades, a significant effort in their proselytization and their inroads into the global South. There's a book that came out 15 years ago called The 10th Parallel, which basically draws a line from Indonesia, across Africa into Latin America, and sees the 10th parallel as the front line in the struggle between the Christian world and the Muslim world. So this is significant.
In terms of the breaks with, or the ruptures within American evangelical circles and within MAGA over Israel, how important do you think that is? Do you think it's overstated, or do you think people are right to be pointing this out?
I think it's very important.
Okay.
You had, I think it was last week, that J.D. Vance had an appearance, an extended, more than 1 hour long question and answer session at a gathering of Turning Point, the organization that was founded by Charlie Kirk, the assassinated activist. One of the questions was a student. He was self-confessed confused, who asked Vance about why the United States was supporting Israel to, in his words, the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. His question was laced with anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish tropes. J.D. Vance's response to that was problematic. In other words, what he said was we have to have dialogue. We will cooperate with the Israelis where we have common interests and not where we don't have common interests. Um, but he did nothing to counter the anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic elements of that question. And I think that's noteworthy. Now, mind you, let's be very clear about one thing, and that is that particularly the trend away from Israel and towards the Palestinians among evangelicals is particularly among youth. And that does not necessarily mean that it becomes more pro-Muslim. The evangelists are Islamophobic often. And there are evangelists just as much as there are segments of the Make America Great Again crowd that, for example, believe in the Great Replacement theory. I think the Great Replacement theory is basically the theory that the non-whites are taking over, are hell bent on extinguishing the white race, and often Jews are portrayed as the ones that are promoting this, but a significant segment of the non-whites who supposedly constitute a threat to the white race are Muslims.
I was going to say, I don't know if you saw that interview between the American conservative commentator Megyn Kelly and Tucker Carlson, where they had an audience in attendance, but Megyn Kelly was asking Carlson why he platformed the anti-Semitic uh, sort of far right wing youth commentator, Nick Fuentes. And Carlson said, well, we have to hear people out. And then he said something about Randy Fine, the congressman who said, well, we have to kill all the Palestinians in Gaza. We have to get rid of them all. They're all terrorists. And Randy Fine, he also pointed out, was making fun of the dead baby pictures that get posted on social media. And Carlson said something along the lines of, Randy Fine has said things that are much worse than anything Fuentes has said. And I was surprised there was like a huge outpour of clapping and cheering. It does seem like there is this rupture, in other words. And I think that moment sort of crystallized it for me.
Well, I think, first of all, there's the whole issue, and I've written 2 pieces about this in the last several days. There was the platforming of Nick Fuentes. And of course, there was the response to that by Kevin Roberts, the head of the Heritage Foundation. But 2 months before the platforming of Nick Fuentes, Carlson platformed Candace Owens, who is equally blatantly anti-Semitic. And
Yeah, she goes on like anti-Talmud rants, like I mean, she's going after Judaism essentially. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. And to be fair, a number of uh, Carlson's own statements are questionable. So I think what you're seeing is that racism as such, uh, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic attitudes are are becoming mainstream. Anti-Muslim attitudes were much more mainstream for a long time, for a number of reasons, and but on a much broader scale, racist, bigotist uh, assessments or views are becoming mainstream and are shared by significant segments of the population.
Before closing out, I'm trying to figure out and put this into words, but I have a hard time understanding why Israel is doing what it's been doing for the past 2 years. I don't mean simply, oh, what they've been doing with Gaza, but also with the West Bank, because I even know, people that consider themselves liberal Zionists that think the Netanyahu approach to the West Bank is insane, foolhardy, and is actually going to like harm Israel long run. And I know there's aspects of the Israeli security state that are even taking issue with Netanyahu. Why is Netanyahu still going in this direction when there's even internal blowback against it? It just seems very strange to me how this is all playing out because there is internal criticism within Israel, and yet Netanyahu is continuously moving in the same direction.
Well, I think what you've got to keep in mind is, first of all, Israel has been moving to the right for almost half a century. So Israel started moving to the right with the electoral victory of Menachem Begin in 1977. And what you've seen over that period is a radicalization. Now, one of the vehicles for that radicalization are ultra orthodox, ultra nationalist religious pre-military academies. So every Israeli Jew serves in the Israeli military, and in these academies, what you're seeing is these are rabbis, often rabbis, who are rabidly racist, rabidly anti-Arab, but also rabidly anti-Jews who don't share their views. So you have a process of radicalization in society, and within key institutions. Some estimates say that up to 40% of the officer corps up until the brigadier level are products of these academies. And clearly, October 7 was a watershed. It suddenly became, it became mainstream. And so the issue is not simply Netanyahu. There's no question that a majority of Israelis have no confidence in Netanyahu, would like to see his back, the sooner the better. But that doesn't mean that they're all liberals.
Or that they want a two-state or anything.
Or
Yeah.
that they want a two-state solution. Some of those fundamental attitudes are very widely shared.
So then is it an issue of Israel having a lot of I guess extremist ideologies that are clouding judgment?
Um, I think, look, I think first of all, you could argue that the philosophy that is being propagated by the ultra-nationalists in these military academies is rooted in Jewish law. Go back to the Code of Maimonides. Now, I have no doubt that the religious leaders in these academies are aware of that. I do not necessarily believe that every Israeli understands that, or every member of the Israeli Defense Forces, but the religious leaders certainly do. And what is said about Jewish relations to minorities is onerous in the Maimonides Code. Now, to be fair, you have onerous stuff in the Quran too. You have onerous stuff in Sharia law. The difference, of course, is that Islam has ruled in whatever territories since the 7th century. There's been evolution. um, Maimonides in the 9th, 10th century, whatever it was, Israel only started ruling in 1948. So whereas a lot of issues were addressed in Islam and had to be addressed because they were in power, didn't have to be addressed in Judaism. Now, to be fair, there are extremist ideologies on the Palestinian side. Just take colloquially, Zionists, Jews, Israelis, colloquially in the Arab-speaking world, are referred to collectively as Yahud, Jews. There's no distinction between the three or four, whatever the categories are, which is also a form of perpetuating prejudice.
Just one more thing, I promise to let you go, but so you've pointed out Donald Trump and Netanyahu are in a lot of ways two peas in a pod, and that they share a tendency to blur the lines between the civilizational and the national, and that they're part of a pattern that we see really taking hold across the globe. And I think this goes back to your point about civilizational states. Can you speak to that? What's the sort of tie-in with all of this, and how is it part of a bigger pattern we see playing out?
Sure. I mean, I've argued for several years now that what we're seeing globally is the rise of a critical mass of world leaders, whether that's Donald Trump, whether that's Vladimir Putin, Chinese President Xi Jinping, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and Netanyahu, who all think in civilizational terms and project a lot of disputes in civilizational terms. They don't necessarily see their countries' internationally recognized borders as their frontiers. They define those frontiers civilizationally. With other words, they all crave other people's land. They're all authoritarians. And that's the context in which I said that Netanyahu and Trump were two peas in a pod, which does not mean that there can't be differences between them. The differences by definition. Their ranking in the geopolitical pecking order. The Americans sit on top. The Israelis probably sit somewhere in the middle. Israeli and U.S. interests differ on a number of issues. And if you take all these developments together that we have been discussing, could lead to U.S. pressure on Israel, even if the commonalities between Netanyahu and Trump are probably greater than their differences are.
Well, I want to thank you again, James Dorsey, for coming on Parallax Views. If you could just plug the Substack real quick.
Sure. I write a column on Substack, which is available at jamesmdorsey.substack.com. It's a column that is reader supported. And so I encourage everybody to please become a paid subscriber. I think in these days, independent journalism is becoming ever more vital. And we independent journalists need all the support they can get.
Amen to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to be on your show.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous
donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters:
Aaron,
Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV,
Sutra,
Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/parallaxviews, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.